page of Kali Tribune. Just to say in advance, I apologize for poor quality of this audio because I'm doing this outdoors. Cannot do it in front of the proper mic, so please bear with me. In this podcast, we'll focus on a saying, one of those sayings that come more or less like an afterthought when we talk about something. It goes something like this. Well, this X or epsilon is just ahistorical. It's not rooted. It's not part of customs. In a word, we'll talk about the notion of historical shallowness, or in other words, shallow roots that some political, cultural, social phenomena has or is deemed to have. Now, I'm certain that most of us, at least a few times in our life, have heard something like that being spoken indeed, that we ourselves considered something ahistorical or historically shallow. But, as is often, or for the most time, the case with sayings like this, when somebody asks us, poses a question, well, what do you mean by that? We get perplexed, excuse me, because it is not something, not a question that yields an easy answer. It needs an elaboration. There is nothing strange about this. At first sight, someone might think that this is simply the case of prejudice, that we just parrot the saying without really having idea what we mean by it. But I don't think this is the case. Most of the truths that guide human thinking are such. That is to say that their explanation, their causes, and their foundations are never present at hand. And in order to understand them, to get to the bottom of why I think like that, one has to invest a considerable effort and considerable time. And one could say that the most difficult truths to attain are precisely that kind of truth. The truths that come from insight, that is to say, thinking that reflects in itself. So, what do we mean by this? I'll offer one possibility, one conjecture. I start on assumption that there is some truth in this saying. The very fact that I cannot, out of the bat, provide a systematic answer to clarify why is this so does not diminish this truth in my eyes. Now, historical shallowness is usually used as an argument by conservatives. And conservatives are notorious, and sometimes by their own admission, of not being able to give account to reasons of some of their principles. Idea being that human mind is not capable to go to the very foundations of being, of being in the world, let's say, for the sake of argument, of being in history, or something like that, or something along that lines, that there is always, quote unquote, irrational factor, irrational rest that always seem to be left behind, is always somewhere in the foundations of everything, and we just cannot get to it. We cannot, but this is very, very important to point out in classical conservative thought. That idea is agnostic, that there is no way of even addressing the existence of this foundation, but we have to act as if it is there. And this is, in my opinion, this is the chief weakness of conservatism, especially in debates with progressives. Let's use this word for the sake of our podcasts, but by progressives I think people that are guided by ideologies, and ideologies, or I would rather use word expression metaphysics, let's say political metaphysics, that are systematic in nature, and for every question there is indeed an answer. And of course, when a conservative is confronted with somebody like that, at first, in the first onslaught, he has no defenses, but conservatives tend to outlive their opponents, because once those quote-unquote ideologies or metaphysics are put in practice, they cause various degrees of mischief by necessity, because they are unrelated to reality, and are trying to appropriate reality into their own systems. Now I am cutting this short because I talked and wrote a lot about this in the past, so not to repeat myself. But there is a different way to look at this problem of historicity, of shallow historical roots. Namely, we can take, for instance, a figure of one historical figure, image of scientist, let's say, of modern scientist, and we can think about, for instance, where is the historical origin of modern scientists? Let's say somebody like Einstein, as he was presented to the popular mind. I would claim that the roots of this image, of this figure, are very recent. They are at this stage about maybe 100 or maybe more years old. Whereas scientists or men of knowledge, of Greek men in habitual possession of episteme, as Greeks would say, methodical knowledge, is very old and has very little to do with image of somebody like modern scientist, because the science for people like Aristotle or Plato or philosophers and theologians of Middle Ages is completely different than it is now. And the attempt has been made to show that modern image is in fact evolved form of early primitive and undifferentiated form exemplar that existed in previous times. But this, at closer scrutiny, is completely false. The knowledge that was sought by somebody like Aristotle was completely different kind of knowledge than the one that is sought by modern scientists, for instance. And the modern scientific knowledge, what is considered to be knowledge, applicable knowledge, and not knowledge in itself, is something completely different. And they are not related, in my opinion, save by analogy. So it's not that, for instance, Aristotle was looking for metaphysics, and then after a long passage of time, somebody figured out that he was having a distorted notion of modern science. He was looking for causes that were metaphysical causes, whereas there is nothing that can be called metaphysical, and that he was just on that low stage of evolution and couldn't understand that the real causes are natural laws, that he must look for laws of physics and so on and so forth. Because Aristotle, somebody like Aristotle, I take him as an example, was never looking for laws when physics is concerned. For instance, this philosophy of nature or metaphysics of nature, Deutera Philosophia, the second philosophy as he called it. He was looking for causes that can answer to a question: what is something, why is something, from whence comes something, and so on. But never in a sense that he would posit a system of laws as we have now, on the grounds of which, or after the pattern of which, phenomena are coming to pass and can be explained, and so on and so forth. So we are talking about quite a different thing here. Therefore, we could say that figure of modern man of knowledge or scientist has a shallow historical root because it doesn't stand in the continuity with its exemplar. Indeed, it rather takes itself as an ideal and projects its own image upon previous times and previous figures, or indeed the exemplar of scientists was somebody, for instance, like Aristotle. Now we have a clue, I would say, for the proposal of the answer to a question, namely that continuity and discontinuity are the chief thing. Because shallowness comes from this continuity that something coming to pass in time has. So, for instance, that something is completely new. It is not in continuity with something that was past, that was before it, or it is in kind of a relative continuity. A reason for this is that continuity is a temporal qualification of the process of causality, of coming to pass. Whereas the past is the vector of the origin or of the cause, continuity is the image, moving image, I would even say, of the procession of effect from the cause. So if something originates, it has to proceed, and continuity reflects this procession because it can always serve to indicate whence something comes from. So to have a shallow roots in history, historically shallow roots, means being in discontinuity, because as Aristotle said, things that are natural happen always or for the most time. Now, this is not to say that history is a stream of heterogeneous continuum of phenomena that subjective consciousness of some historian or somebody like that interprets. No, this does not mean that. No, this means that everything coming to pass in time comes to pass according to cause, and there is an original cause, there is an origin, because everything tends to let's say proceed and differentiate. Whereas if you follow the causes back, this procession backwards, if you revert it in your mind, if you reflect it back into its origin, you slowly but surely end up with the one origin. And this is so I'm pointing this out because I find very problematic today that most, let's say, most grounded and most popular answers to what we could, I think, with no bad conscience call lunacy of what is called progressivism. Answers are conservative, but conservative answer is not really an answer. It's a more like a reaction that capitulates before the fundamental question. It claims agnosticism, the most stupid mental attitude one can get, because it is neither fish nor flesh. Either you believe in God, for instance, or you don't believe in God. There is no middle ground. I mean, it's senseless if there is a God or there is an origin, if you like to talk in this abstract metaphysical term, then knowing this origin is the main thing to know. And if you claim that there is, but there is no way of knowing it, then if you can't know the most comprehensible thing, that is to say, most perfect thing, that makes everything else more or less perfect in image of itself, then agnosticism means that, well, we are in some way accidental. We are living in a world that is not made by accident, but we ourselves are, for some reason, by accident. And this is a pretty absurd notion, I would say. Also a notion with a very shallow historical roots. The main thing is that this continuity with the past is something that is to a large extent demonstrable, although it is sometimes very hard to explain. And in everyday living, most of us perceive it when we feel threatened by something that is completely out of place for our culture, for instance. And then in our day and age, because we live in times where zeitgeist and the mentality of the masses is such that everything that brings about change is automatically accepted. It is intimately accepted by virtually all of us. Only some of us are fighting this, because the only thing you can do at first stage is realizing this and trying to oppose it in yourself, trying to fight it. And this is not an easy thing. This is our, let's say, historical given. And when we perceive such things, we usually don't have a ready-made answer of what bothers us. Something is awkward, something is felt to be artificial, but you cannot really explain why. You cannot explain what is natural, and you cannot explain what is in continuity with history, with tradition, with your culture, whatever. Well, I think we have a hint here with this Aristotle's notion of always or for the most time, because it can be transposed into historical existence, in societal existence, which also has this continuity. So you cannot come into society that is still rooted in its origin and go on completely changing its mores overnight, introducing new religion, introducing completely different notion of marriage or whatever. you cannot really do this except on superficial, albeit quite destructive level. People, of course, are in a predicament because most of people really can't pinpoint where they could take their stand in their own minds. Because, as I said, this is the prevalent mentality today. Everybody participates in it, whether he likes it or not, to some extent. But obviously, there are answers to these questions, and these answers are what we could call metaphysical. They step one step deeper and at the same time higher than answers that, for instance, conservatives give. They don't stop halfway. So, for instance, I would say that this figure or symbol of continuity, because symbol is something that conjoins what is invisible and visible, what cannot be completely explained and what can be depicted, even depicted in words. And continuity is a symbol of causality, of procession of what is from its origin at all levels. And if there is no continuity, there is no procession, there is no causality, and there is no origination, there is no reality. The thing, for instance, the custom that is imposed upon some society without continuity is artificial in the sense that it is a construct of someone's imagination that is violently pressed upon people's minds, written in laws, and the most important thing is that it has to be enshrined in law, because this kind of ungrounded, historically shallow thinking needs laws, because laws serve as a kind of spell casting on reality, because they make reality conform to them in a way, not the other way around. That should be proper, that everything comes from reality, whatever refined form it could take. It has to have this continuity with what actually is. Whereas, for instance, you can impose the law that two men can marry each other or something like that, and make this law obligatory. And what you will achieve is that you will occupy and coerce people, citizens of the state or ethnic group that you impose this upon. So this is quite real dichotomy. And this defense against this oppressive politics of dissolution we all suffer from, the defense is in cherishing continuity, but also, I would say, in understanding what is continuity. Not necessarily in the quite abstract and, let's say, philosophical way I put it forward now, but in each and every facet of life, because continuity can be discerned and explained. Only it needs time, it needs reflection, and it needs insight. It needs knowledge about oneself. For instance, on political level, it requires knowledge about one's people, real knowledge, and existing as part of that people. Accepting, because there is something very seductive in rejecting this continuity. By rejecting continuity and your historicity, you reject the burden that comes with it. And it all comes with burden, with a cross, one could say. Because not only that people's histories are spotless, but they are quite tainted indeed. But this, they are real. Whereas this, what is shallow, what is uprooted, is not real at all. Anyways, I think that would do for now. I hope you suffered through bad audio. Promise it won't happen again. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.